Hello, I'm Jim Cornell, and this is Base to Base, the weekly biotech podcast from Air Coastal Media. Yes, welcome again to the Base to Base biotech podcast, and this is number 47, and it's going live on February the 20th. It's another packed podcast for you this week, so I will limit my input, which may come as a relief. And besides, nothing really happened this week anyway, so we'll move on to the interviews shortly. Last week we chatted with Vibhor Gupta, director and founder of Pangea Data, and with Endogene Bio CEO Maria Teresa Perez Ceballos. This week we're talking about, among other things, an accurate and fast test to diagnose prostate cancer with Valley Diagnostics CEO Dave Taylor, and on gene therapy for retinal diseases with Lance Baldo, CEO of Beacon Therapeutics. If you do have news or suggestions for who should be on the podcast, or indeed any other suggestions or comments, please do get in touch via jim@deeptechdigest.com, which is also the address you can use if you're interested in advertising with us or for event coverage. Okay, before we move on, let's take that quick look at the news you may have missed over the past week at deeptechdigest.com. SPT Labtech and Bellbrook Labs introduced a high-throughput screening platform for cancer research. We had an article on creating a new option for treating diabetic retinopathy, and there is a new model to study colorectal cancer. Syngene and Johns Hopkins University are looking to advance early-stage drug discovery. Amacathera, who you'll be able to hear an interview with on the podcast very soon, was named Life Sciences Ontario Emerging Company of the Year. And there'll also be an interview soon with Kynova Therapeutics, which has raised 32 million Canadian dollars to develop immuno-oncology and inflammation therapies. A collaboration is going to develop novel therapies for neutrophil-derived inflammatory diseases. Hancor Bio has received FDA orphan drug designation for its gastric cancer drug, and there is a new strategic partnership to advance space-based life sciences research infrastructure, which isn't easy to say. A new company has been created to tackle pediatric cerebral palsy. We had an article on modifying CAR T cells to kill solid tumours, and you can read all of these and plenty more at deeptechdigest.com. Right, let's get into those two interviews, and definitely a couple of good ones today, and very important ones too. And the first of them is with Beacon Therapeutics, about a real unmet need, because when there's a condition with no treatment, that is pretty urgent. Beacon is a gene therapy company tackling inherited retinal diseases, including X-linked retinitis pigmentosa. Our guest today is the company's CEO, Lance Baldo. Hi Lance, I know you get up early because you're on the West Coast, but I really do appreciate you doing this early in the morning Pacific time. So perhaps to get things started, you could give me a bit of a background on the company.
Yeah, in Beacon Therapeutics, we're a ocular gene therapy company. And so essentially what that means is that we focus on using genetic medicines or gene therapies, particularly to try to treat them within the eye and try to provide help for people that are living with or suffering from devastating blinding diseases, both rare, and we'll spend some time talking about the most advanced program that we have in a rare type of inherited retinal disease, but also in more prevalent retinal diseases as well, such as dry AMD or geographic atrophy, Jim.
Right, yeah. Could you tell me a little bit more about some of the conditions that you work on?
Yeah, the most advanced therapy that we have right now is a product called Laruzova, and that's just a derivation of the often tricky scientific names. And that's used to treat a condition called X-linked retinitis pigmentosa. And essentially what that is, by being it X-linked, it predominantly but not exclusively affects males because males only have one X chromosome, XY. And in this case, it's in a class of so-called inherited retinal diseases, sometimes shortened to IRDs. And these are diseases of the eye that, just as the name suggests, are going to be genetic or inherited from the patient's parents, of course. And in this case, being X-linked, again, affects predominantly males. And it's a very progressive disease, Jim. So it initially starts in early childhood when a young boy is maybe 7, 8, 9 years old and they start having trouble seeing in dark. And maybe they'll start bumping into things in the evening and they'll often express to their parents like, hey, I'm, having trouble seeing and walking around my room. And then generally by the time in their teens, they're having more trouble seeing. And by the time they're in their 20s, having trouble with things like reading, activities of daily living, and driving. And then unfortunately, by the time most of these patients are in their 40s and latest really 50s, they're legally blind about half of the time. So it's considered to be what's called a very progressive disease. In other words, the onset is very early and the progression of the disease goes relatively quickly. And right now, Jim, there's nothing that can be done for these patients with X-linked retinitis pigmentosa, which I'll start saying XLRP probably from now onwards.
What's the kind of incidence of that, either in the US or globally, if you have those figures?
Yeah, we do. We know the epidemiology quite well. If we just look at the US and what we call the EU4, so the larger EU countries plus the UK, there's about 20,000 patients that are living with this condition. If you look across the entire world, there's just under 200,000, Jim, so about 190,000 patients that are living with what's called RPGR mutated XLRP, which is the condition that this medicine is intended to treat.
This seems quite a lot. I know that kind of still pushes it down towards the rarer diseases, but is the recognition of that disease something that is an issue? Because many people will not have heard of it.
Because it's a genetic disease, there's often knowledge within a family that someone else in the family has suffered, often a male, an uncle or someone's father had suffered from this disease. So there tends to be better awareness of the disease within kind of these family systems and family trees, Jim. But the more important thing, which I think your question alludes to, is the testing for this disease. Fortunately, there's fairly good and widespread availability of testing. In fact, there's panels now for patients that have suspicion of so-called inherited retinal diseases, where with a buccal swab, a swab inside the mouth, you can test for about 300 of these genetic mutations. And fortunately, RPGR mutated XLRP, which is the disease that this medicine treats, is one of those tests that's within that panel as well. But awareness is incredibly important. We also are very thankful. There's patient advocacy groups really across the world, but particularly in the US, one called Foundation Fighting Blindness, FFB is what they're called for short. And that helps to create awareness of some of these diseases, including a lot of information available on their website for people that think that they might be suffering or someone that they love might be suffering from this particular condition, Jim.
Is it something where early diagnosis is critical?
That's an interesting question. In the future, I would say yes. Right now, because we don't have any treatments that are available, it's all supportive. Hey, get your affairs in order because you're going to slowly and progressively go blind. Make sure that you're getting prepared for what your eventual future is going to hold as you have this progressive blinding disease. In the future, once we have a therapy like Laruzova available for these patients, I believe earlier diagnosis is going to be better because it's going to be something that we can actually do for these patients in terms of an intervention. That being said, the pivotal study, which is now fully enrolled. So as you know, in our industry, it's really important to do these larger studies to make sure that the medicine works the way we expect it to work. And our study happens to be called VISTA. It fully enrolled last July, and it's a 12-month primary endpoint. So towards the latter half of this year, Jim, we're going to get the readout for that VISTA study. And that VISTA study is going to be the foundation that's going to provide for ultimately the authorization. And in that study, and it relates to your question to age, we enroll patients from about 12 years old all the way up to 50. And so far in the phase 2 data, we're not seeing, and they're relatively small numbers, but we're not seeing any age dependence. In other words, we're not seeing that only young patients benefit or older patients don't benefit. So we think there's going to be a pretty broad so-called therapeutic window for this medicine, but it's probably, and we don't know this with certainty yet, probably going to be better to treat these patients sooner rather than later to try to avoid the progressive degradation of their vision over time, Jim.
You mentioned that there aren't any treatments, and quite often with conditions, there aren't any treatments, but you can do something even though it's not really effective. So is there really, it's one of those conditions where there's absolutely nothing and nothing to mitigate it at all?
Nothing to mitigate at all. I mean, in my industry, a lot of people throw around the term high unmet need, and sometimes it's warranted and sometimes it's not. I will say in this case, that term high unmet need is truly warranted. And it's one of the reasons why, and we're very thankful, we've had so much interest from the clinical community, from the patient community, giving us a lot of support for the work that we do. In fact, our last fundraising round, we just closed a $75 million fundraising round at the end of 2025 in December. It was led by Goldman Sachs, but we also had the venture philanthropy arm of the Foundation Fighting Blindness. It's called the RDF, or the Retinal Degeneration Fund, join us as well. And it just really provides that support and really that validation that they really want to see us do good things. And hopefully this medicine, really make a difference for these patients that are suffering from this devastating disease for which there's nothing available right now for them in terms of treatment.
Are other companies other than yourselves looking into these conditions?
There are. And so generally, I like to think of the companies that are working in this space, they fall into kind of two categories. Gene specific. So when you know the particular mutation, in this case, we know that these patients have RPGR mutated XLRP. So therefore, we're developing what's called a gene specific therapy. We know exactly the mutation, we know exactly the protein, that's the target, and then we replace or augment that protein. And then there's a whole nother kind of category of what are called gene agnostic. And those are basically saying, hey, we're going to do something in the back of the eye to hopefully make those cells in the back of the eye work a little bit better over time. And the most common therapy being developed there is sometimes called optogenetics. So basically looking at the use of light to be able to generate some signals to go into the back of the eye to hopefully help people see a little bit better when they are quite blind. We believe, and the clinical community has told us, that for patients that have a known and well-characterized mutation, the best thing to use is likely, if not certainly, going to be the medicine that was developed exactly for that mutation. And within that space, right now, the only medicine that's currently being actively developed, and hopefully we're going to get the readout towards the end of this year. There was one product that did it, unfortunately, and there are a couple of historical failures within the space in the past. We're now improving upon what we've learned from those failures to hopefully make Larazova be a success. And some of the things that we've done, Jim, we've optimized the so-called capsid. So the medicine, the genetic medicine, the viral load is inside of a capsid. We've optimized that capsid. We have a good promoter. The promoter makes the gene of interest actually be transcribed. And then we make sure that we've optimized the actual gene that we're putting within the cells of the back of the eye to produce the full-length protein that's mutated within this particular disease. And so what we tried to do is learn from the decade of experience that we've had and be able to kind of advance that forward, and really also brought some great talent around the table, including we hired our chief medical officer is an individual by the name of Dr. Dan Chung, and he's worked for the entirety of his career in gene therapy in the back of the eye, including some time at the NIH. And so just really trying to assemble a team of experts that's well suited to bring this medicine forward to patients in need.
Sure. So could you maybe go into a bit more detail on Larazova and how it works?
Sure. And so in the case of patients that have RPGR mutated XLRP, they have this, mutation in this particular gene that's causing a protein to be produced that's just not functional, non-functional RPGR protein. That protein localizes to a place within the photoreceptors. So the photoreceptors are the cells in the back of the eye that sense light. And in between them, there's an outer segment and an inner segment. So there are these long kind of stalks that help see light. And in the middle, there's an area that's called the connecting cilium. And that's where this protein works. And it's involved in protein transport and energy transport between those inner and outer segments. So basically, when patients have this disease, that RPGR protein is non-functional and those photoreceptors stop working properly. Eventually, they will die. And, at that point, we consider that to kind of be the point of no return. So hopefully, if we can catch these patients early enough, we give the medicine by something called subretinal delivery. So essentially, put a needle in the eye in the operating room. You put the needle in the back of the eye, as you would figure out from subretinal. We inject the medicine in the back of the eye, and then it gets taken up by the photoreceptors within the back of the eye, within the retina. And then those photoreceptors, once that viral vector takes over, it starts producing that RPGR protein that then localizes to that connecting cilium that I mentioned, and then makes those photoreceptors start acting the way they should in the past. And what's really cool about this therapy, Jim, is that many therapies stop progression of disease. We actually see improvement of function of photoreceptors. So patients can see 5 letters, 10 letters, 15 letters better on an eye chart. If everyone's familiar with an eye chart, every line is 5 letters. So imagine being able to see 1, 2, 3, sometimes even 4 or 5 lines better on an eye chart. And that's what we've seen in some of the early phase 1, and particularly the phase 2 data when we were looking at a measure called low luminance visual acuity, which is like a standard eye chart, but it's done in low light conditions.
So is this a one and done, or is there more therapy that you need to do?
That's the hope, is that this can be one and done. And so far, we have data that goes out to 5 years, Jim, that shows very good durability, so-called durability of effect out to 5 years, and also safety. With any of these gene therapies, I mean, you always have to be vigilant to make sure that there's not any adverse events that are happening that are going to be, worse than the therapy that's actually being administered to the patient. And so far, we've seen a really good so-called risk-benefit profile as well. The other really nice thing, and I'm sure, Jim, that you're familiar, and many of your listeners will be familiar with kind of some of the work that's going on in gene therapy. Systemic gene therapy, there's a whole set of issues that you have to deal with because you're administering the gene therapy essentially throughout the body. With ocular gene therapy or gene therapy in the eye is a so-called immune privileged organ. So it's kind of encapsulated and protected from the rest of the body. We're putting the medicine in the eye, and therefore that medicine stays relatively localized to the eye. And so we worry less, we still worry, but we worry less about so-called systemic side effects, things like liver toxicity, for instance, which you have to worry about quite a bit with some of the systemic gene therapies. We don't have to worry about as much. In fact, we've seen none at all within the eye. And so it's my particular belief and belief of our investors that the eye is perhaps the perfect organ to kind of test the hypothesis of gene therapy for a number of reasons. One, Jim, I already mentioned it's immune privileged, and so it tends to be a safer organ. But the other is it's an organ that we could very, very readily kind of test clinical effect. There's numerous things we can look at. Is your vision getting better? Is our light stimuli getting better? How does the back of the eye look when we take a picture of it using computed CT scan, et cetera? And so it's a really good organ to test the hypothesis of gene therapy and whether or not we can show meaningful improvement for patients, Jim.
You mentioned some of the clinical trials. Where are you at right now with the pathway for trials?
Yeah, we finished enrolling the VISTA pivotal trial in July of last year. In fact, the last patient had the medicine administered towards the end of July. That is an 85 patient study across 3 arms. There's a high dose group, a low dose group, and then both of those groups will be independently compared to an untreated control arm to see how much improvement we're able to show in terms of patients that are treated versus not. And the 2 key variables that we're looking at there, and there's numerous endpoints we're looking at, Jim, but the 2 key variables I've already mentioned: low luminance visual acuity. All your listeners will be familiar with an eye chart. Think about an eye chart done in low light conditions. That's where the low luminance visual acuity comes from. And the other measure we're looking at is something called microperimetry. So essentially, you look at the back of the eye and you try to see the light sensitivity at various points in the eye to see how much improvement you can do in terms of light sensitivity measured in decibels. So both sound and light sensitivity are measured in decibels. And that study is going to be reading out towards the end of this year. And that's the study that's intended to support worldwide registration for this medicine. So we're just quite excited. I mean, to be 8 or 9 months away from knowing how well this medicine works is just super exciting, humbling, nerve-wracking, but just ultimately where, as a physician scientist, it's ultimately where I'd love to be.
Right. And you did mention the fact that you got funding toward the end of last year. What does that mean for the company?
Money's always good because it allows us to go after the opportunities we have in front of us. And what that additional money does, it allows us to have considerably more what we call runway, of course, after the readout, to figure out what the best path forward is to commercialize and make this therapy available for patients. Will that be a partnership with pharma company or companies? Will that be a sale to a company that can do this, as well or better than we can? Or if the markets continue to cooperate, might we consider an initial public offering or an IPO towards the end of this year or into early next year, really to make sure that we can do everything we can to get this medicine approved, manufactured, and then get it to patients in need. And just very thankful for our investors to continue to give us that support and the validation of the really important work that we're doing as well.
As this one comes to that almost end phase, are there any other things in your pipeline?
Great question. We do have one earlier stage program, another, set of fancy letters, but BTX 001, which is a gene therapy that's delivered intravitreally. So if you're familiar with drugs like Eylea or drugs like Lucentis, they're given by a needle into the so-called vitreous, so the kind of gel part of the eye. So this is going to be an intravitreally delivered medicine that's intended to treat a much more prevalent condition called dry AMD or geographic atrophy. And this is a very, very prevalent condition that affects millions of people around the world. Right now, there's currently only two approved therapies that are not approved in Europe, by the way, only approved in the US, and they're targeting something called the complement system. And this gene therapy is also targeting the complement system. And the theory here is that the big challenge with the currently approved therapies is treatment burden. You have to go back every 1 or 2 months to get the injection in the eye, and you don't feel any better, Jim. So unlike Eylea, unlike Lucentis, where you actually get improvements in vision, you're not seeing that with the currently approved therapies. So the theory here is, can we give someone a one-time injection of the eye that would then stabilize their vision, hopefully for many years, if not, indefinitely as well. That drug right now is being studied in monkeys, non-human primates, in toxicity studies, with a plan to open up an IND, investigational new drug application with the FDA, and start studies towards the second half of this year when we'll start moving into patients and really start with dose finding and safety.
You talked about how the eye is a great opportunity to study gene therapy. Is that why there's so much interest in the field?
It's my personal, but I know for me, it was some of my personal belief in the field as well. We're seeing quite a little bit of a resurgence in gene therapy in the eye as well. You asked the question about kind of the landscape of players here. There's dozens of companies that are looking at different ways that we can bring gene therapies to different conditions within the eye. The other thing I'd say, Jim, is I've worked across large and small pharma for the better part of 20 years within my career. One amazing thing about ocular gene therapy, particularly in the rare disease area, we're more supportive of each other than we are competitive. I want successes in this field. Successes in this field are going to be good for me. And so it's really great to see how we all band together and really try to help each other out as well to make sure that we can just advance the field forward and bring medicines for these patients that are suffering from devastating diseases for which there's many cases, not all cases, but in many cases, no available therapies. The only approved gene therapy for the eye is Luxturna, which was innovated by a company called Spark. And it's been almost a decade. I think that was approved in 2017. It's almost been a decade since that was approved. So it's been a long time. Now, the good news, Jim, is we've learned a lot in those 10 years, and we're going to take those learnings. We've already applied them to our product, Larazova. But it's been a decade. That's a long time between the first and potentially the second therapy to come to market. And I'd hope that the third and the fourth and the fifth are going to come a lot sooner. We want to be the second. That's our ambition. But I hope the third and the fourth and the fifth will come very soon after that as well, Jim.
Is what's being learned in ocular gene therapy applicable to gene therapy in other areas?
Much of it is. A lot of it, particularly on the technical side, the way you optimize capsids, the way you optimize promoters, the way you think about the so-called gene or the gene of interest that you're putting within the cassette, which is actually the vector itself. So a lot of that is going to be what's not really useful is kind of the application of it and the administration of it, right? Because obviously the eye is very different than something that's going to be administered, within the spinal, within the brain, within places like that. So there's clearly some areas where there are synergies and things that can be learned, and then there's areas which are just absolutely totally different. One of the other nice thing about the eye is that we are getting better and better at ways to administer these medicines. Like a decade ago, subretinal gene therapy administration was only capable by a handful of people. Now there's, at least 20 centers that are able to do this in the US. More than that, they're able to do it in Europe. And even recently, I had the privilege of seeing one of these surgeries done within the US, and there were fellows in the room, so-called doctors in training, surgeons in training that were learning how to do the procedure. And I asked them, I said, why in particular are you interested in this? And say, well, we think this is going to be the future of medicine in the back of the eye, and we want to get really good at it. So when we go out and practice on our own, we'll be able to kind of take those techniques and apply them within our practice. And a decade ago, Jim, you never would have seen that, right? It was super specialized, but now it's going to become in the future, not common like intravitreal injections, but considerably more widely available for these patients that need it.
That's excellent. Yeah. And hopefully that extends on a global basis as well, as opposed to, just within the richer countries, which is always a consideration.
I think so. Really, you're speaking to something, Jim, called access. And my vision, my goal as the CEO here is I want every patient who could potentially benefit from this medicine to be able to get it. I don't want there to be barriers to access. I don't want there to be barriers to reimbursement. And so when we think about our strategy to so-called commercialization strategy, we want to make sure that we do everything the right way or the best way that we can to make sure that every patient across the world that can benefit from this therapy actually can. And there will be differences, right? Certain countries are going to have access sooner than others. That's just always the way it works, unfortunately or fortunately, within our industry. But the goal here is to be able to make sure that patients all around the world can benefit from this therapy, Jim.
It's pretty exciting times for the company. How do you, obviously, 2026 is pretty exciting just because of that potential launch of a product. But what other milestones do you have that you're looking forward to?
Yeah, I think many CEOs like to say this, but this is going to be the transformative year for this company. We're going to have, as described prior, the pivotal readout towards the end of the year. We'll start the regulatory work with the regulators towards the end of the year. We're continuing to work on our manufacturing as well to make sure that the medicine is available for patients. And then on the earlier stage program that I mentioned, we're actually going to be moving into the clinic. We're going to be moving that into patients within the context of controlled studies. So this year has a whole bunch of so-called catalysts that we're looking at. And then as we move into 2027 and beyond, we start talking about regulatory authorizations, we start talking about launch. And so it gets pretty exciting for us as well. And just a thrilling time to be in the seat I'm in. And I know I hope I speak for much of Beacon when I say that we're just absolutely thrilled for what this year and the future holds for us.
Are there any challenges associated with that transition to, as opposed to being in the clinical trials, to being the step beyond that?
There certainly are. There's always so-called growing pains, and the change from being what sometimes called a clinical stage company, a commercial stage company, it can come with some growing pains. But fortunately, what we've brought around the table are a number of people and leaders that are available to kind of be able to help us with that transition overall, and also those growth associated with us. The hiring plans this year, we're going to be relatively stable in terms of overall numbers. But as you start to think about commercialization, particularly around the world, Jim, those numbers, those number of people, the numbers of employees that we need, they start to go up. I wouldn't say dramatically, but they certainly start to increase.
Some really important work going on there. And what's even more exciting for the company and for patients is that 2026 really is going to be a hugely pivotal year. Now, you hear a lot about prostate cancer, whether it's Movember or through the various campaigns taking place. One of the biggest issues with the disease is diagnosis. It's not a great process, and it's also not that accurate at times. There are some cancers you get tests for in the mail every couple of years, and that might be the case for prostate cancer as well, as Valley Diagnostics in the capital of Wales, Cardiff, is developing an accurate and fast test for prostate cancer. The company is working on other things too, and we will hear about those as well in a conversation with the company's CEO, Dave Taylor. Thanks for being with us today, Dave. It's great to talk to you about something exciting and hugely important. Maybe you could tell us a bit about Valley Diagnostics.
We actually have evolved from a previous company that we had. We had a software company, which we set up to develop a app and cloud-based reader system to read and quantify the results from lateral flow tests. And as part of that, we spent a couple of years doing that. We raised some cash. We had a couple of customers on the go and a few projects in development. And as you do with these things, we met a whole raft of really interesting people in a variety of different industries. And one of the projects we ended up working on was a research project with a team who were based in Aberystwyth University. Turns out that these guys were experts in metabolomics research, and they were using some very advanced techniques to discover biomarkers for diseases in a variety of different carrier fluids, focusing initially on blood, but then moving very quickly onto urine. And as part of our software development part of the business, we've been working with a couple of lateral flow companies using our software to image and then upload to the cloud the images along with the associated metadata, and then use an AI to quantify the results on a lateral flow test. So it being a yes-no answer, or being able to say, well, that's a yes answer, but there's a 75% chance that it's a yes based on the density of the pixels in the result. And if you recall the way that the COVID lateral flow test looked, sometimes you'd see a very faint line, sometimes you'd see a very strong line. So we were able to quantify those results. Anyway, the short version is that we thought there's some really interesting work going on here with this research work at Aberystwyth. And we talked about it for quite a while, and we decided that actually we could pivot, let's say, and actually get into the business of exploiting that research and developing our own lateral flow devices to detect certain disease profiles. So we did that. We closed the previous company. We acquired the software platform from that previous company, and we formed Diagnostics. And you're absolutely right. The name is a little bit of a nod to the location. We're based in Cardiff, obviously South Wales, Aberystwyth is kind of mid to North Wales on the coast. There's lots of amazing valleys in between us and Aberystwyth, so it kind of made sense, as a nice kind of nod to the heritage. My co-founders, there's myself, there's my previous colleague from our previous company, and a guy called Dr. David Rook, who is an expert in metabolomics and in translational chemistry. He was working with the team at Aberystwyth. He came in as a co-founder, and we brought in a guy called Professor Lewis Muir, who is the leader of the metabolomics research team at Aberystwyth, as one of our advisors and one of the key players in the research and development. So that's kind of where we started and how we got into the place that we're at now. And the team at Aberystwyth were working on 2 or 3 areas of research in particular at the time. So they were looking at metabolomic research for biomarkers for bovine TB in cattle. This is where they kind of started the whole process, but they rapidly moved into human disease profiling. And the 2 key areas they were looking at were prostate cancer and lung cancer. So that was where most of the research was going, and that's what we focused on as Valley Diagnostics. So our key direction of travel is prostate cancer, and then secondary to that, we're looking at lung cancer, and we also have a third project on the go now, which is looking at breast cancer. So it's all using the same technology. And I say we, I mean the research team. We take samples, urine samples, and this is super important. It's really key that we emphasize that it's all based on urine samples. So we take urine samples, and the researchers can examine those urine samples using mass spectrometry technology in the lab. And from that, they can identify, eventually, after a whole load of work, specific biomarkers which describe that disease very specifically. So for example, we have a portfolio of biomarkers. We call it a fingerprint for prostate cancer, which consists of around 12 or so different biomarkers. And we fine-tuned that right down to 5 specific biomarkers, which are the 5 key biomarkers. And we can use those 5 biomarkers to very accurately diagnose prostate cancer in the urine sample from any man. We got something very similar for lung cancer, both at a similar kind of stage of development. So what that means is, when I say we can diagnose the presence of prostate cancer, we can actually tell specifically with almost 94% accuracy if that man has prostate cancer or not from that urine sample using that mass spectrometry technology. And the plan for that, which is what we're working on now, is to take that work and translate that into a lateral flow test, which can be used pretty much anywhere as you would a COVID lateral flow test.
And what implications does that have in terms of speed? Because obviously, if you test for prostate cancer now, not only is it a long-winded process, it's not very accurate and it's not that inexpensive either.
Yes, you're absolutely on the money there, Jim. There's a short question with an enormously long answer to it, so I'll try and go through it in in a couple of chunks so it makes sense. You're absolutely right. The concept of the lateral flow test is it will be very low cost. I mean, you're talking a few quid, and what that few quid could mean, anything from 20 quid to 30 quid or whatever, but it's still a few quid. So relatively speaking, it's very low cost. So, the benefit that we see is low cost, it's easy. Anyone can pee in a pot, as I frequently tell people. So, because it's a urine sample that we're taking, we're not taking blood, so you don't need to involve any blood experts. And you can use that urine sample immediately on the lateral flow test, or you can put it in a jar, keep it for a couple of days, and use it a couple of days later in a different location. And you get a result on the lateral flow test within 15, 20 minutes. So it's a very quick result. And that result is very accurate, 94% accurate. So it is very cheap, it is very quick, it's very accurate, it's very easy to use. Compare that to the current process of diagnosing prostate cancer, and you probably know this already. If you're over a certain age, typically mid-50s onwards, and you think you're symptomatic, or you think you've got an issue, prostate issue, or you may have history of prostate cancer in your family, you can go and request a PSA test. That's the sort of front line, if you like, in testing for prostate cancer. The issue is that the PSA test, which is a blood test, so you need to take a blood draw, so you have to go to the doctors or to a medical facility to get the blood taken. The issue with the PSA test is that it does not actually test for prostate cancer. It only tests the level of prostate-specific antigen, which is in your blood. And as most people don't really know, that can mean a number of things. A raised level of PSA can mean, and in most cases does mean, you have some kind of issue with your prostate, but not necessarily prostate cancer. It could be benign prostate hyperplasia, for example, or some other conditions. It's really just an indicator that there may be an issue, and that issue may be prostate cancer. So typically what happens then is you have a raised level of PSA, you will then be referred for further testing, which inevitably takes time. Quite often you get a digital rectal examination, which is the finger up the bum test, where the surgeon has a poke around and has a feel to see if they think that your prostate is enlarged. That's not quite so prevalent now because it's not very accurate. It relies so much on the expertise of the individual performing the test. And then you would then typically go for an MRI. Again, I mean, great MRIs are great, but they're not that accurate because, again, it's a lot down to the interpretation of the scan result. If the interpretation suggests you may have a problem, you will then be referred on for a biopsy. And it's only when you get to that biopsy stage that you really get a clear diagnosis of what the problem might be. And even at that stage, it depends on the biopsy that you're given. Some of the biopsies are more accurate than others. There are much more accurate biopsies available now, but they're more expensive. They're still very invasive. And always, as always with a biopsy, there is quite a degree of danger involved in that. And it's really uncomfortable. I mean, most men who've had a prostate biopsy will attest to how deeply unpleasant the whole process is. So, that takes an absolute age to get to that point from that very first piece of PSA testing. And it's only when you get to that biopsy that you've really got any notion of what the problem might be. And there's some really interesting stats from the NHS. Of all of the men who go all the way through to biopsy, 75% of those men do not have prostate cancer. It's a great thing because they don't have prostate cancer, so that's something to celebrate. But that's a huge chunk of men going through that whole process to find out that they do not have prostate cancer. Time off work, cost to the NHS, cost to their insurance company if they're privately insured, stress, grief, all the issues that go with that. And the test that we're developing can completely change that. We can completely remove that whole level of uncertainty to get to that biopsy stage. There's a huge amount of space for improvement in that whole testing process, not to mention the fact that we can test men significantly earlier. So we don't have to wait until they're, mid to late 50s, early 60s. We don't have to wait till they're symptomatic. We can test much earlier and we can detect the presence of the prostate cancer biomarkers, depending on ethnicity, from anything from late 20s through to late 30s onwards. So for Caucasian guys, tends to manifest slightly later. So, mid to late 30s, the biomarkers start to appear. For black guys, tends to be slightly earlier, sort of late 20s to mid 30s when the biomarkers start to appear. So we can get in there really early, detect the biomarkers, and allow those men and their doctors to make much earlier, more informed decisions about how best to proceed with the next stage in their monitoring and their treatment.
Do you envisage that being then something that, obviously, your physiology is different at 30 than it is at 60? Do you envisage it something being like every 5 years or every year or sort of periodically so that you can catch things earlier?
Yeah, again, another great observation, great question. In an ideal world, what I would like to see is when we eventually get the test through the market and get our regulatory approval, and we actually get into the field, as it were. My goal would be for the Valley Diagnostics prostate cancer test to become exactly as you've described, so an early stage screening process. So there's no reason why every man over a certain age, say let's say 35, couldn't be sent one of these tests in the post. Do the test, and if there's an issue, they can get that dealt with immediately, or start to get that dealt with. And then subsequently, just do that test as you suggested every 5 years maybe, or every 10 years. And that would allow the system to be in control of when those prostate cancer cases were discovered. So again, lifestyle changes can be made, all the stuff that surrounds that and can help with the early treatment and the early mitigation of something like prostate cancer can start significantly earlier, 20, 30 years sooner than it currently does. So rather than men rocking up with stage 3 or stage 4 prostate cancer, we can catch it stage 1, stage 2, and actually do something about it, more easily, more successfully, and with a lot less angst and challenges for the men and their families, and a lot less cost to the NHS and the associated systems that surround that.
It's obviously a very big area in terms of publicity, and it's something that's very out there with ads, and everybody seems to know about prostate cancer. Because of that, are there a lot of companies working on different or potentially new diagnostics?
First of all, let's say it's really good that a lot of these guys, sports personalities, politicians, kings, are all coming out and actually making people aware of the fact that it's a problem. So it's in the public eye, as it should be, because it is a big issue. And again, you're absolutely right. There are a lot of people working on a variety of different diagnostic techniques. Obviously, we've done quite a lot of background work in looking into this to see what the competition is, as it were. Interestingly, most of the people working on prostate cancer diagnostics are working on blood-based lab tests of some sort, which is interesting. It's interesting because they're all going down a similar kind of pathway. Blood is the obvious choice because it's what people usually use for diagnostic testing, but it comes with all kinds of issues. You've got to take the blood, you've got to look after the blood really carefully. It's obviously a hazardous substance, and it's just generally more difficult to work with. And the time taken then to do the blood analysis is always longer because it's always a lab-based test, or pretty much always a lab-based test. And they generally referred to as liquid biopsies. Some of them are ferociously expensive. Some of them are very accurate, but they're really expensive and very time-consuming. So personally, I think that's not necessarily the right direction to go in. I think the lab test using blood, there is a place for that in the whole method of diagnosing things like prostate cancer. But I don't think it's necessarily the most appropriate method for an early stage, more screening focused process. I think that there's too much time and cost involved in that. There's some really interesting stuff going on recently, which you've probably heard about. There's a big trial going on, and part of that trial is using an AI enhanced MRI system, which is, again, really good. Great that there's another method being developed and being tested. But the problem with that is it's still using MRI, which is a really resource intensive method of diagnosing anything. The equipment's really expensive. The operators, the technicians are really expensive. Really, got to be trained. It's very time consuming. Every MRI that you take, you go in, it takes a couple of hours of your time. By the time you've got to the hospital, you've had your MRI done, you've got ready and gone home. It takes a lot of time for the analysis to be done. And unfortunately, it's still not very specific. It's still relying on the MRI scan. Does the MRI look like there is a problem with the prostate or not? It's not telling you specifically that you have prostate cancer or not. It's still really just a kind of warning, if you like. There may be a problem here. We better fast track you into a biopsy situation. So great that that's happening. Great that all of the other lab-based blood tests are in development. But I think they're all missing a trick. I think the route to a more accessible, more widely available, accurate test is the route that we're taking. And I think that's where the direction of travel will start to go over the next few years.
How have you been able to get it to be so accurate when you compare it with the 25% accuracy of blood?
Fantastic science. What's key is we're looking for very disease-specific biomarkers which only exist in the body if the patient has the disease. So these biomarkers will only be in your urine if you have got prostate cancer. There's very little room for maneuver there because the biomarkers are either there or they're not there. There is a degree of variance, obviously. But if you don't have the biomarkers, there is no way that you can have prostate cancer because those biomarkers are created by the cancer. And as an example, I've got a whole raft of stats which I could throw at you. I won't give you all of the stats, but as an example, with our lab testing, if we're looking at what I call a population screening setting, so a low prevalence of the cancer in a big group of people, population level, we're getting a negative predictive value of 99.5%. So I put it into plain language. A negative predictive value of 99.5% means if the test result is negative, there is a 99.5% chance that the person truly does not have the disease. So on a population screening scenario, you can clearly see who does not have the disease. So you're really fine-tuning that, and only those who may have a problem can then be sent forward for a biopsy. So we can use that test to completely circumvent the need for PSA monitoring, DREs, MRIs. We can screen out all of those men who we know for sure, or well, with 99.5% level of for sureness, that do not have prostate cancer. So it's really narrowing the field down and focusing in on those that where there may be some doubt. And if you flip that, obviously, our overall level of accuracy, I said, was 93%. So we know from the rest of the stats that we've crunched, there is a almost 94% chance that if you got a positive from our test that you have got prostate cancer. So it's incredibly accurate in that respect. And I think that's a real game changer in terms of being able to find who has got prostate cancer, find who has not got prostate cancer, and remove the need for all of those men to go through that whole process needlessly and save their time, save their energy, save their angst, save their disruption, and save the NHS a huge amount of cash. Our early estimates, we believe there is potential to save the NHS £60 million in biopsy costs every year by screening out all those who definitely do not need a biopsy. So think about that. That's an enormous amount of wasted resource that we could redeploy elsewhere and have better outcomes for the individuals involved.
Do the biomarkers change over time? Like, would you be able to determine whether it's stage 1 or stage 4? Is it just got it or don't have it?
Another great question. I can't give you a definitive answer to that because we need to do more science. We need to do some more investigation. But what I can tell you is that as the cancer progresses, the prevalence of the biomarkers does increase. So, it does get to be a stronger signal, as it were. And what we're also able to do, we haven't done this yet, but we predict we can do this with other biomarkers in the portfolio. We will be able to produce a test which allows us to monitor the change in the presence of the biomarkers in the body. So we'll be able to detect if a disease is getting worse or is it stable, or if it's getting better. So we can say for sure, yep, you've got prostate cancer biomarkers, you've got prostate cancer or not. And then as time moves on, with another version of the test, a second version, if you like, it could be a companion diagnostic, which then can be used alongside any treatment profiles in order to help to identify the success or not of those treatment profiles based on the changes in the biomarkers in the body. We're not there yet with that.
Right. Yeah. Well, with the first one, where are you at? I mean, what's the rollout pathway look like?
There are several stages. We've done a big chunk of the big science. We've obviously got the biomarker discovery work. We know what the biomarkers are, the identities. We can run tests in the lab using our lab techniques on urine to detect prostate cancer. We've been through the next phase, so we've done all of the purification and the translational work with those biomarkers into antigenic molecular material. And we're now at the process of raising the antibodies based on those antigens, which will be used then to develop the actual lateral flow test itself. So that's the next stage of development for us, is translating all of that work into the actual lateral flow test. We've probably got about another, 8 or 9 months to go till we have a prototype lateral flow test. So towards the end of this year, probably beginning of end of Q3, start of Q4, we'll have a prototype which we can then run some clinical studies on, which will take us through a big chunk of 2027. And our aim is to have all of those studies completed by end of Q2, middle of Q3 27. And we should be in a position by the beginning of Q1 28 to offer this as a market-ready product. The plan is to go at different channels. We should be able to sell directly to the public, over the counter or direct. We've already started working with a couple of insurance companies who are interested in what we're striving for. And obviously, we're going to be working next year with some teams that we're very close to in the NHS in north of England. And they're going to be doing some of our clinical study work for us with a view to getting adoption as quickly as possible into some of the prostate cancer diagnostic pathways across some of the NHS trusts in the north of England. So we have a clear pathway in the UK. We're working with an organisation in the USA as well to map out the best way to bring it to the market in the States. Again, that will be probably early to mid 28. And obviously, wherever else we can get the right relationships going, we'll be looking at those markets as well.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about partnerships. Are there any potential partners, or do you need partners for this?
Short answer is yes. We do need partners, and we would like partners. I mean, in an ideal world, what we would like to do, and this is something that we're also working on in the background in terms of developing relationships, in an ideal world, we'd like to be working with existing diagnostics companies who have a global footprint or have a footprint in different jurisdictions globally, probably a better way to put that. We have no real interest in Valley Diagnostics becoming a huge kind of rumbling international behemoth. We want to be much more agile and partner up with existing potential distributors who already have those footprints and those distribution channels in their international markets, and allow them to license the products and take those to the market in their jurisdictions. From our perspective, that's the quickest way we can get these tests into the hands of the people that need them, because that's the underlying drive. We want to get the prostate cancer test into the hands of men who can use the test to help themselves avoid real issues of prostate cancer. That's the underlying mission of the company. Obviously, if we can make some decent profit out of that, we can then reinvest that in the other stuff that we're working on and bring more of these products to the market so that we can help even more people.
Obviously, prostate cancer is a global issue, and hopefully the price that you were mentioning, the cost of this, will be able to get this distributed globally as opposed to just in select few countries.
Again, absolutely right, Jim. The key in terms of cost is in volume. So the more that can be produced, the lower the unit cost can be. With COVID, countless millions of COVID tests were being produced around the world every week, and the actual cost of manufacture was probably pennies in some instances for the COVID tests. I can't see us getting down to that in terms of cost of goods, because we're not going to be creating that huge a quantity. But there's no reason why we can't bring that point of sale price right down to a much more affordable level, given the right volumes, and that will give us the opportunity to pretty much, as you say, work globally, any country. And you're absolutely right, prostate cancer is a problem. It's much more prevalent in developed nations at the moment. There's a whole raft of reasons for that. One of those reasons is age-related, actually. If you look at India, for example, I mean, Europe and USA and UK, pretty similar statistics in terms of percentage of population. If you look at India, the current known percentages per capita of instances of prostate cancer is a bit lower, but there are several potential mitigating circumstances there. A, the record keeping isn't clear or as accurate, but the average age of men in India is significantly lower than the average age of men in the West. So, perhaps one of the reasons is that the prostate cancer hasn't started to manifest yet because it hasn't become visible because the men are significantly lower average age. But, imagine the potential issue that the Indian healthcare system is going to have in, 15 years' time, 20 years' time, when half of that billion plus men in India start to develop prostate issues, whatever percentage of that half a billion men will start to develop prostate issues. And this is exactly the kind of test that could help to mitigate some of the downstream issues with that.
And where are you at with the other tests that you're developing? You mentioned other cancers and bovine TB.
The lung cancer test, we're at a similar development stage, arguably slightly ahead, in fact, in terms of the raising of the antibodies, and we've started work on the prototype of the actual test itself. We're developing an ELISA first, and then we're going to follow that through with the multiplex lateral flow test for lung cancer. We've probably got a longer adoption process for the lung cancer test, a whole raft of reasons for that. We're focusing mainly on prostate cancer because that's the one we want to get to market as quickly as possible. And in terms of the breast cancer test, we're at a very early stage on that. We're actually going through the biomarker discovery phase right now with breast cancer. So we're probably about a year away from having a biomarker portfolio, fingerprint, for breast cancer. So, that will then be another couple of years gestation in terms of the test development beyond that. So it's following along, but a little bit behind. In terms of the bovine TB test, we're actually significantly more advanced with that. That was the original work that the team did at Aberystwyth. So we've had a little bit of a head start on that. We have a prototype test available as a lateral flow. We've had a very, very small scale trial in the Republic of Ireland with that. We had some excellent results in terms of detecting bovine TB in cattle. And we're now working towards scaling up that prototype to a bigger batch of prototypes. And we're going to be doing a larger in-field study in Ireland later this year to gather a bit more evidence to allow us then to go forwards, to go through the regulatory process to get that ready for adoption, at which point we'll be able to bring that directly into the market. So probably about a year away from market in terms of the bovine TB test. And that's an interesting one. It's not on most people's radar, bovine TB. What impact does that have on me? As the man in the street, not much visible impact is the answer. But it costs governments around the world an enormous amount of money. So the UK government spends around 100 million quid a year on bovine TB countermeasures. Most of that is paying compensation to farmers for the culling of animals. So it hits the government's pocket enormously. It causes enormous amounts of grief for the farmers who could potentially see half their herd wiped out in a cull. Makes it very difficult for them to recover from that. And it just causes all kinds of cattle and herd management issues. So we're, super keen in the background to make sure that we get that through into the market as well.
All of the diagnostics that you're working on, quite often you find that improved diagnostics helps with the drug development process. Do you think that will be the case with what you're working on?
Yep, absolutely. Totally in agreement with that. And that kind of refers back to something I said earlier about companion diagnostics. One of the things that I think is going to be really important in the future, let's take lung cancer, for example. Lung cancer is a really interesting one because there is currently no real method for early diagnosis of lung cancer. And as we all know, the longer lung cancer goes undetected, the worse it gets. And it gets a lot worse pretty quickly in a lot of cases. If we can introduce an early diagnostic, we can help people much earlier to avoid the increase in the in their lung cancer. Step forwards now, if someone is undergoing treatment for lung cancer, and one of my colleagues in Valley Diagnostics is currently undergoing treatment for lung cancer, there is a very clear scenario where a second-gen version or a different version of our diagnostic test could be used to monitor the progress of that treatment. So we can look at whether or not there is a metabolomic change in the body of the patient as they're undergoing treatment. So that's something that I think is going to be really important. If you're on a treatment course, you can do this test on a regular basis, and we can measure the change in those biomarkers, which gives us a really clear picture of whether or not that treatment is having the right effect or not. Moving forwards, I think it's something that, the big pharma companies who are working on lung cancer treatment drugs, for example, would be crazy to ignore, because it's something that they could very easily deploy alongside their treatment protocols.
Definitely seems like it's a case of when this is going to happen and not if, and what a massive difference this will make globally, not only financially, but to the lives of so many people. Conversations like the two we had today do definitely give rise to a lot of optimism, that's for sure. So that's it for this week's podcast. Long, but I am sure you will agree, well worth it. If you do want to get in touch with guest opportunities or you want to advertise, please feel free to contact us at jim@deeptechdigest.com. So until next time, wherever in the world you are, I hope you have a great week ahead. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join us again next time for another Base to Base Biotech podcast. The Base to Base Biotech podcast is an Air Coastal Media Limited production.